evening, and welcome back to the Moonlit Whispers. This is Snowfall and the Midnight Cookies, Part 2. Last night, we wandered through Frostbrook's quiet streets and into the warmth of Margaret's kitchen, where cinnamon, cream, and moonlight mingled in peaceful hush. This morning, the snow still lingers, wrapping the town in soft silver light. Margaret stirs awake, Whisk stretches by the hearth, and a new day begins in the sweetest calm. So find your warmest blanket, settle in, and let's return to Frostbrook, where every flake carries a story, and every cookie holds a little comfort. The first light of morning came softly, like a sigh through the curtains. It slipped between folds of fabric and drifted across the room, pale and tender, brushing over the quilt where Margaret lay sleeping. The world outside was still wrapped in white. Every rooftop, fence, and tree bowed under the weight of the night's snow. For a while, the house remained perfectly still. Only the faintest sounds stirred the muted crackle of cooling embers in the hearth, the soft rhythm of Margaret's breathing, the steady tick of the clock downstairs. Then, as if the day had gently remembered itself, Whisk stretched. The cat uncurled from the crook of Margaret's knees, arched his back in a long, elegant motion, and gave a quiet chirrup. His tail flicked once before he padded across the bedcovers and settled near the edge, blinking into the growing light. Margaret stirred moments later. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the brightness that touched the room like brushed gold. She remained still for a few breaths, cocooned in warmth, listening to the hush that still blanketed Frostbrook. The snow, she thought, must have fallen all through the night. She reached out from beneath the quilt, fingers brushing the cool air, and pulled the blanket closer for just a moment longer. Whisk gave a small, expectant meow, and she smiled without opening her eyes again. "All right," she murmured, her voice hushed from sleep. "I suppose breakfast won't make itself." She sat up, the quilt falling in soft folds around her. The room glowed faintly, the silver blue of morning mixing with the amber left from the embers. Her breath made a small cloud as she exhaled. The air held the crispness of winter, but not the bite. It was the kind that felt alive, like something freshly made. Margaret swung her legs over the side of the bed, her slippers waiting neatly on the rug. As her feet slipped into them, the wool felt warm against her skin. Whisk hopped down and led the way toward the door, tail high and proud, as if guiding her into the new day. The hallway smelled faintly of wood smoke and cinnamon. Somewhere downstairs, a beam creaked softly in the cold. She drew her shawl around her shoulders and descended the stairs, one hand gliding along the polished banister. Light from the window at the landing spilled across the wall, bright enough now to show the lace patterns of frost on the glass. Each one looked different, tiny, crystalline ferns and feathers that caught the morning glow. When she reached the bottom step, warmth greeted her like an old friend. The fire in the sitting room had kept its slow burn through the night, a low orange flicker that pulsed behind the grate. Margaret moved toward it, stirring the embers with the iron poker until they sparked awake again. She added a log, then another, and waited until the flames caught. The room brightened almost immediately, filling with that gentle, living light that only a morning hearth can give. Shadows retreated up the walls. She crossed into the kitchen, and the scent met her at once, the faint sweetness of baked sugar that still lingered from the night before. On the counter sat the covered plate, the cloth she'd laid over it, now lightly dusted with flour she hadn't noticed in the dim lamplight. Margaret lifted the corner of the cloth, and there they were, her midnight cookies, still perfectly golden, a few sugar crystals gleaming like frost. "Well," she said softly, "you survived the night, didn't you?" She chose one and broke it in half. The inside was tender, buttery, faintly warm from the air. She handed a crumb to Whisk, who sniffed and gave an approving purr before licking his paw with great ceremony. Margaret smiled and turned to the stove. She filled the kettle and set it to boil, watching as the first curls of steam rose, twisting upward like the breath of the morning itself. The quiet between the bubbles of water felt vast and kind. Outside the kitchen window, the snow had stopped. Frostbrook lay beneath a flawless sky, pale blue at the edges, brightening to gold where the sun touched the horizon. Every branch sparkled as though dusted with crushed glass. A robin hopped along the fence, leaving neat tracks in the snow before vanishing behind a drift. She poured hot water into her teapot, the porcelain clinking faintly. The scent of black tea filled the air, grounding and familiar. While it steeped, she laid out her breakfast: a few cookies, a slice of buttered bread from yesterday, and a small dish of winter jam, spiced plum, dark and glossy. Whisk sat by the window, tail curling neatly around his paws, watching the light move across the snow. Occasionally, his ears twitched at the sound of distant carriage bells or the call of a bird overhead. When her tea was ready, Margaret poured it into her favorite cup, the same one with painted holly leaves from last night. The steam rose gently, and for a moment, the whole kitchen seemed to breathe with her. She took a sip. The flavor was strong and rich, softened by the hint of milk she'd added. A simple pleasure, she thought, but one that made the whole morning feel steady. The town outside was beginning to stir. Across Maple Lane, she saw faint wisps of smoke rising from neighboring chimneys. A man in a heavy coat shoveled his walkway, his breath clouding in front of him. Somewhere, a dog barked, a bright sound against the snowy quiet. Margaret finished her breakfast slowly, savoring each bite. The cookies had deepened in flavor overnight, just as she'd known they would. The spices were rounder now, less shy, the sugar's edge softened by time. She made a small mental note. These would be perfect to share, perhaps with Mrs. Green across the lane. After breakfast, she washed the dishes in warm, soapy water, her movements unhurried. The morning light shifted as she worked, growing stronger, slipping across the counter and onto the walls. When she dried the last cup, she set it on the shelf with a quiet clink. From somewhere upstairs, a draft whispered down the stairwell. Margaret drew her shawl tighter and crossed to the front door. The brass latch was cool against her hand. She opened it, and a wave of clean, bright air rolled in. The world outside dazzled. Snow glittered in every direction, blinding and beautiful. The road had become a white ribbon leading toward the town square, lined with untouched drifts. Footprints dotted the path here and there, perhaps from early risers making their way to the bakery or post office. She stepped out onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked softly under her slippers. Frost rimed the railing, delicate and glinting in the light. She took a deep breath, the air crisp enough to sting slightly, and smiled. Whisk appeared behind her, careful to stay just inside the threshold. He peered out suspiciously at the snow, flicked his tail, and decided that the warmth of the kitchen was preferable. "Smart choice," Margaret murmured with a laugh. "I'll only be a moment." She brushed snow from the top step with her sleeve and watched as the flakes lifted and shimmered like dust in sunlight. The quiet was almost total, broken only by the occasional soft collapse of snow from a nearby branch. Frostbrook looked transformed, reborn, even. Each chimney sent up its own ribbon of smoke. Every window pane gleamed. The air carried that unmistakable smell of winter morning, faintly woodsy, faintly sweet, and alive with the promise of another slow day. After a few minutes, Margaret returned indoors, closing the door softly behind her. The warmth enveloped her again like a gentle embrace. She moved toward the sitting room and began her morning rituals, the kind that anchored her days, no matter the season. First, she opened the curtains fully. The light poured in, washing the room in brightness. Next, she tended to her plants on the windowsill, a small pot of ivy, a wintering rosemary sprig, and a violet that had bloomed stubbornly even as the days shortened. She watered them just enough, whispering, "There, that's better," as she set the tin watering can aside. Then she tidied the small table by the fire, stacking the books neatly and straightening the framed photograph of her mother and younger self, both of them smiling, dusted with flour, a plate of cookies between them. The memory glowed in her chest, a quiet, steady warmth that never fully faded. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, its reflection bouncing off the snow outside and sending pale shimmer into the room. Margaret settled into her armchair, knitting basket at her feet. The rhythm of the needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Whisk found his usual place on the windowsill, paws tucked neatly under his chest. Hours seemed to pass without rush or notice. The house felt alive in its own quiet way, the way old houses do when they're filled with gentle routine. Every so often, Margaret paused her knitting to glance outside. Children were beginning to appear now, bundled in scarves and mittens, dragging sleds down the lane. Their laughter rose and fell, soft and far away. It made her smile. She could almost feel the echo of that kind of joy, the one that exists only in cold mornings and endless snow. By afternoon, she decided to bake once more, not cookies this time, but small bread rolls, something to fill the air again with warmth and spice. She gathered her ingredients, letting the process flow as naturally as breathing. The scent of yeast and butter joined the lingering sweetness from the night before. While the dough rose, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a small note on cream-colored paper. Her handwriting, round and careful, flowed easily. "Dear Mrs. Green, the snow is quite something this morning, isn't it? I've made more cookies than I can manage alone. Would you like to share a few this afternoon? Warmly, Margaret." She folded the note, slipped it into a small envelope, and placed it in her coat pocket. When the rolls were baking, she donned her boots and stepped back outside, leaving Whisk watching from the window like a sentry. The snow crunched under her feet, soft but certain. The world was a canvas of white and shadow, the sunlight turning the air almost golden. She walked carefully along Maple Lane, her breath forming pale clouds. At Mrs. Green's gate, she left the note tucked between the latch and the wood, secure against the wind. As she turned back toward home, she noticed how still everything seemed again. Even the sound of her footsteps felt hushed, absorbed by the snow. Back in her kitchen, she removed the rolls from the oven, their crusts golden and split just slightly at the top. The smell was rich and homey. She brushed them with butter while they were still warm, the sheen catching the light. Whisk wound around her ankles, hopeful for a taste. "Patience, my dear," she said, laughing softly. "We'll have ours with tea." She set 2 rolls on a plate, poured herself another cup, and sat at the table once more. Outside, the light had shifted toward afternoon paler now, the shadows lengthening across the snowbanks. There was a knock at the door. Margaret looked up, surprised but smiling. She rose and opened it to find Mrs. Green herself, wrapped in a thick shawl, cheeks pink from the cold. "I saw your note," Mrs. Green said warmly, holding a small tin, "and thought I'd bring something in return. Fig jam. I made it last summer." Margaret's eyes lit up. Perfect timing. The rolls just came out of the oven. The 2 women settled at the table, sharing tea, cookies, and stories. Their laughter, gentle and low, filled the kitchen like music. The conversation meandered whether old recipes, childhood winters in Frostbrook. Whisk eventually claimed Mrs. Green's lap, much to her amusement. Outside, the light continued to fade. By the time Mrs. Green rose to leave, the first hints of evening had returned to the sky. She thanked Margaret, promising to send over her scone recipe the next day. When the door closed again, the house fell back into its calm rhythm. Margaret tidied the cups, humming softly. The melody was old one her mother used to hum on nights like these. By the time dusk arrived, the fire in the hearth had been built up once more. The snow outside began again, light and slow, as though the world were exhaling. Margaret changed into her flannel nightdress and set the kettle to boil. Whisk followed her from room to room, ever curious, ever content. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, the same way she had the night before, and carried it to the window seat. Outside, Frostbrook glowed again under its veil of snow. Lanterns flickered along the lane, their lights soft and golden. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, slow, steady, reassuring. She sipped her tea and looked toward the counter, where a few cookies still waited in their tin. "Midnight again soon," she whispered with a smile. When the clock struck 12, she was ready, cookies, tea, Whisk at her side. The ritual complete, she took one small bite, savoring the sweetness that seemed to melt right into memory. The world outside was perfectly quiet. Snow fell. The fire whispered. Time itself seemed to pause, content to linger here for a while longer. When she finally rose to go upstairs, the air was filled with the scent of cinnamon once more. She moved slowly through the darkened rooms, extinguishing lamps one by one, until only the faintest glow of embers remained. In her bedroom, the quilts waited, the cat followed, and the night was patient. She climbed into bed, pulling the blanket to her chin. Whisk circled twice before settling near her feet. The snow outside thickened again, the flakes swirling in graceful, endless motion. Margaret watched them until her eyes grew heavy. The rhythm of the fall, the warmth of the hearth, the soft tick of the clock, all of it blurred together, dissolving into something deeper than thought. As she drifted toward sleep, her last waking breath carried a whisper. "Good night, Frostbrook." Outside, the snow kept falling, steady, soundless, and eternal. Inside, the little house at the end of Maple Lane glowed faintly in the darkness, holding its own quiet world of warmth and peace. The scent of cinnamon lingered once again, and somewhere beneath the quilt, a cat purred, steady as the snow, steady as the heart of the home. And then there was only stillness, soft as sleep, gentle as morning, endless as the snow. Margaret smiled in her sleep, Whisk curled close by the fire, and the scent of cinnamon lingered like a dream that didn't quite end. Thank you for visiting Frostbrook tonight, and for sharing another sleepy tale with me. Until next time, may your heart be warm, your dreams be kind, and your night be sweet. Good night from the moonlit whispers.